There's a moment in every war when you have to choose between the uniform and the human being underneath it. For Margaret Hayes, that moment came at 3:47 in the morning on June 12, 1944, and it would define the next 50 years of her life. She's 22 years old, a British Army nurse stationed 3 miles behind the Normandy beaches, and she hasn't slept in 36 hours. The field hospital is overwhelmed. 300 wounded men crammed into a tent designed for 50. Blood on every surface, the smell of gangrene and disinfectant and fear thick enough to taste. The doctors are working through a backlog that grows faster than they can cut. And Margaret is doing what nurses do in war, making impossible decisions about who lives and who waits, and who gets morphine for the pain that won't end any other way. The German prisoner arrives just before dawn, carried in by 2 American soldiers who look like they'd rather drop him in a ditch than waste a stretcher on him. He's maybe 19 years old, pale as milk, with a piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate buried in his abdomen, and blood soaking through the field dressing someone applied hours ago when they should have let him bleed out. One of the Americans, a sergeant with Tennessee written all over his accent, stops Margaret as she moves toward the German boy. "Don't waste your time, ma'am," he says, not unkindly, just stating what everyone in the tent already knows. He's enemy. He's dying. And we got 200 boys out there who actually matter. Margaret looks at the German. He's conscious, which is worse than if he weren't. Conscious enough to know he's in enemy hands, conscious enough to be terrified, conscious enough to understand that nobody here is obligated to save him, and most of them would prefer not to. His eyes meet hers, and she sees something that will haunt her for 5 decades. Not a soldier, not an enemy, just a boy who wants his mother and knows he's never going home. She makes a choice that defies every rule, every priority, every practical calculation about resource allocation in a combat zone. She tells the sergeant to put him on a table, tells the orderly to prep him for surgery, tells the doctor, Captain Morrison, who's been operating for 14 straight hours and looks dead on his feet, that this one can't wait. Morrison stares at her like she's lost her mind. "He's German, Hayes. We have British boys bleeding out in the corner who've been waiting 4 hours. You want me to operate on a German? I want you to operate on a 19-year-old kid who's going to die if you don't," Margaret says, and her voice has a steel in it that surprises even her. "And last I checked, Captain, we took an oath that didn't include a nationality clause." Morrison looks at her for a long moment, then at the German boy, then back at her. He's too tired to argue and maybe too decent to ignore her when she's right. He nods, scrubs in, and operates on the enemy while British soldiers die waiting their turn. The surgery takes 3 hours. The German survives, which is more than anyone expected, and less than Margaret hoped. Survives in the sense that his heart keeps beating and his lungs keep pulling air. But the infection sets in anyway, the fever comes, and for 6 days he hovers in that terrible space between alive and not alive, where the only mercy is morphine and time. Margaret sits with him when she can, which isn't often, but is more than she should. She doesn't speak German, and he doesn't speak English, but she holds his hand when the fever makes him cry out, wipes his forehead with a wet cloth when the chills hit, whispers things in English that he can't understand, but maybe doesn't need to, just the sound of a human voice treating him like he matters, like he's worth saving, like the uniform he wore doesn't define every cell in his dying body. On day 7, the fever breaks. He opens his eyes, properly open, not the delirious half-consciousness of infection, and looks at her, really looks. And in halting, broken English that sounds like he learned it from a textbook written in 1890, he says, "You are angel. You save me when you should not. I will remember. Always." She wants to tell him that angels don't exist in field hospitals, that she's just a nurse doing her job, that he shouldn't thank her for basic human decency, but she doesn't. She just squeezes his hand and says, "You're going to live. That's enough." 3 days later, he's transferred to a POW camp in England. They don't say goodbye. There's no protocol for goodbye between a British nurse and a German prisoner, no framework for acknowledging what passed between them in those 6 days when she chose his life over the practical mathematics of triage. He's just gone one morning, and Margaret goes back to saving men who wear the right uniform and tries to forget the boy with the grateful eyes who called her an angel. She doesn't forget, can't forget, because some moments don't fade, they just burrow deeper, becoming part of the architecture of who you are. And for Margaret Hayes, 3:47 a.m. on June 12, 1944, is the moment she becomes Tepsi. The war ends, and Margaret goes home to Sussex, back to a cottage that feels too quiet after 3 years of screaming men and artillery thunder. She marries a teacher named Robert in 1947, has 2 daughters, works at the local hospital doing the same job, but without the blood and the dying and the impossible choices. She builds a normal life, the kind of life that should erase the war, should let her forget, should fill the spaces where the memories live. But she can't forget the German boy, doesn't even know his name. In the chaos of Normandy, nobody bothered recording the names of enemy wounded, and even if they had, Margaret wouldn't have had access to those records, wouldn't have been allowed to ask, wouldn't have had any legitimate reason to care about a prisoner who was just one of thousands processed through British hands in the summer of 1944. She tries anyway. Starts writing letters in 1952, 7 years after the war ended, when her daughters are old enough that she has time to think about things besides feeding and clothing and teaching them not to touch the stove. She writes to the War Office, to the Red Cross, to German veteran organizations that are just beginning to form in a country still digging itself out of rubble and shame. She describes him, 19 years old, maybe 5'10", blonde hair, shrapnel wound to the abdomen, field hospital near Caen in June 1944. But it's not enough. It's never enough, because there were tens of thousands of 19-year-old blonde German boys with shrapnel wounds in 1944, and most of them are dead, and the ones who aren't don't necessarily want to be found by the people who beat them. The responses are polite but useless. The War Office tells her that prisoner records from field hospitals weren't maintained with the same rigor as permanent POW camps. The Red Cross tells her they're still processing millions of requests from families looking for sons and fathers and brothers who never came home. The German organizations tell her what she already knows, without a name, without a unit designation, without anything except a face she remembers, and a moment nobody else witnessed. Finding one soldier is like finding one specific grain of sand on a beach that stretches from Hamburg to Munich. She doesn't stop. Can't stop. Because it's not really about finding him. Not entirely, not anymore. It's about proving to herself that the moment mattered, that saving him wasn't just a pointless gesture that delayed his death by a few months or years, that somewhere in the world there's a man who lived because she chose to see him as human instead of enemy. She needs that proof the way other people need religion or hope or certainty that the universe bends toward something other than chaos. Her husband doesn't understand. Robert is kind about it, patient about it, but he doesn't understand why his wife spends hours writing letters to German strangers about a boy she knew for 6 days 50 years ago. He's probably dead, Maggie, Robert says gently in 1965, after she's been searching for 13 years. And even if he's not, what are you going to do? Knock on his door and say, "Remember me, I held your hand while you were dying"? Some things you have to let go. But Margaret can't let go because the German boy promised he'd remember, said it in broken English with the certainty of someone making a vow that transcends language. And she needs to know if he kept that promise. If she mattered to him the way he's come to matter to her, not romantically, nothing so simple or inappropriate, but as proof that in war, in the worst place humans create for each other, there are still moments of grace that don't disappear just because the guns stop firing. The years accumulate, 1970, 1975, 1980. Her daughters grow up, move away, start families of their own. Robert retires. Margaret keeps writing letters, keeps searching, keeps hoping that somewhere in Germany there's a man who remembers a British nurse who saved him when she shouldn't have, who held his hand when nobody was watching, who chose his life over military logic and arithmetic and everything that made sense in June 1944. She's 68 years old in 1990 when the Berlin Wall falls, when Germany reunifies, when the Iron Curtain that's divided Europe for 45 years finally dissolves. She watches it on television, young people with hammers and joy tearing down the concrete that's kept half of Germany sealed away from her search, and feels something stir that she thought had calcified into resignation. If Germany can reunify after 45 years of separation, maybe she can still find the boy who's no longer a boy, the soldier who's no longer a soldier. The life she saved that she spent half a century trying to confirm still exists. She starts searching again with renewed intensity, writing to organizations in East Germany she couldn't reach before, contacting newspapers in Dresden and Leipzig and Berlin, placing advertisements that sound absurd even to her. British nurse seeks German soldier she treated in Normandy, June 1944. Shrapnel wound, field hospital near Caen. If you remember, please respond. Nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that should mean she's searching for a ghost. Then, in March 1994, 50 years and 9 months after she saved his life, she receives a letter from Stuttgart. The handwriting is shaky, the English is careful, and the first sentence makes her hands tremble so badly she almost can't read the rest. "Dear Madam, I am the German soldier. I remember. I have been searching for you also." His name is Ernst Kohler, and he's 70 years old when he writes that letter, a retired postal worker living in Stuttgart with a wife and 3 grown children and 8 grandchildren who've grown up hearing about the English angel their grandfather met during the war. He's been searching for Margaret almost as long as she's been searching for him, started in 1948 when he was released from the POW camp and returned to a Germany that didn't exist anymore, just rubble and shame and millions of people trying to figure out how to live in the country that lost. He tells her this in letters they exchange over the next 3 months. Dozens of letters that move from careful politeness to the kind of honesty that only comes when 2 people share something nobody else can understand. He tells her about the 6 days in the field hospital that saved his life, not just physically, not just the surgery and the antibiotics and the morphine, but the way she held his hand when he was dying, the way she talked to him even though he couldn't understand the words. The way she made him feel human instead of enemy, worth saving instead of expendable. He tells her he thought about her every single day for 50 years. Not romantically, he makes that clear, wants her to understand it's not that kind of remembering, but as the person who defined what mercy means, what humanity means, what it means to choose right over easy when nobody's watching, and nobody would blame you for choosing wrong. He tells her about lying in that POW camp, recovering slowly, surrounded by German soldiers who hated the British for winning and hated themselves for losing, and how he'd think about the British nurse who saved him and feel something other than hate, something that felt like hope that not everyone had become a monster in the process of fighting monsters. He tells her he tried to find her, wrote to British authorities in 1950, asking if they had records of nurses serving near Caen in June 1944. They told him what the British told Margaret when she searched for him. Field records weren't maintained, nurses were anonymous, and even if they weren't, why would Britain help a former enemy soldier track down one of their nurses? He tried again in 1965, again in 1975, again in 1985, each time hitting the same wall of bureaucratic impossibility and practical impossibility, and the simple fact that Margaret Hayes was too common a name and he didn't know it anyway. Only knew the nurse, the angel, the woman who saved me. Margaret reads his letters with something that feels like vindication, and something else that feels like completion, like a story that's been missing its ending for 50 years, finally finding the last page. She writes back telling him about her search, about the hundreds of letters, about the nights she'd lie awake wondering if he was alive or if she'd wasted half a century looking for a memory instead of a man. She tells him about Robert, about her daughters, about the normal life she built while carrying him with her like a stone in her pocket, not heavy enough to sink her, but heavy enough to always know it's there. She tells him something she's never told anyone else, that saving him changed her. Not just made her feel good about herself, not just gave her a story to tell at dinner parties. She's never told the story at dinner parties, never wanted to, but changed the fundamental way she saw the world. Before Ernst Kohler, she was a nurse who followed orders, did her job, kept her head down, and her emotions locked up the way you had to in war if you wanted to survive it. After Ernst Kohler, after choosing his life over military logic, she couldn't see the world the same way, couldn't reduce people to numbers, couldn't accept that some lives matter more than others based on which flag they salute, couldn't look at anyone, patient or stranger or person on the street, without seeing them the way she saw Ernst, as someone's son, someone's love, someone who matters even when it's inconvenient for them to matter. In June 1994, 50 years and 1 week after she saved his life, Margaret Hayes and Ernst Kohler meet face-to-face for the first time since he was transferred to the POW camp. The logistics take months to arrange, visas and travel, and the simple fact that they're both 70 years old and flying halfway across Europe isn't as simple as it used to be. But Ernst's children arrange everything, insist on paying for Margaret's flight, set up the meeting in their home in Stuttgart because their father is too nervous to meet in a public place, too afraid that 50 years of remembering will collapse when confronted with reality. Margaret arrives on a Tuesday afternoon in June, the same month they met, though the weather in Stuttgart is nothing like the weather in Normandy. Sun instead of rain, gardens instead of craters, peace instead of war. Ernst's daughter meets her at the airport, drives her to their home, warns her gently that her father has been pacing for 3 days, that he's terrified she'll be disappointed, that the boy she saved has become an old man who doesn't deserve the pedestal he's been on for 50 years. Margaret almost laughs at that because she's been thinking the same thing, that the nurse he remembers was 22 and brave and certain, and the woman walking up to his door is 72 and tired, and has spent 50 years wondering if she imagined the whole thing, if the moment that changed her life was just another wartime trauma that she's given too much meaning to, because giving it meaning was easier than accepting that war is chaos and nothing means anything except survival. Ernst opens the door before she can knock, and they stand there looking at each other, two old people who were young once, who shared 6 days 50 years ago, who've been searching for each other ever since without really knowing what they'd do if the search ever ended. Ernst speaks first, and his English is better than she remembers, but his voice is the same, carries the same weight of gratitude and memory, and something close to reverence. "I told you I would remember, I told you always." Margaret starts crying, which she didn't mean to do, didn't want to do, but can't help because 50 years is a long time to carry something and not know if it mattered. And now she knows with the certainty of Ernst's face, Ernst's voice, Ernst's presence, that it mattered, that saving him wasn't just a gesture, but a choice that rippled forward through decades, through his life and her life, and the lives of everyone they touched after that moment in June 1944 when she chose mercy over logic. "I remember too," she says, and they embrace like old friends instead of former enemies, like two people who've known each other forever, even though they've spent 50 years apart. They spend 4 days together in Stuttgart, and it's strange and perfect and not quite like either of them imagined during the 50 years of searching. Ernst introduces her to his wife, Helga, who's heard so much about the English angel that meeting Margaret feels like meeting a character from a story her husband has been telling for 5 decades. Helga embraces Margaret without hesitation, without the awkwardness that should exist between a wife and the woman her husband has thought about every day for 50 years, because Helga understands, has always understood, that what Margaret represents isn't romance or infidelity, but something deeper and stranger. Proof that her husband was saved not just physically but spiritually by a moment of grace in the worst place humans create for each other. Ernst shows Margaret his life, the postal routes he walked for 35 years, the garden he tends with the patience he learned during 6 days of fever and morphine, the grandchildren who carry forward a life that shouldn't exist because by every reasonable calculation he should have died on June 12, 1944, in a field hospital that had no reason to save him. He tells her about the choices he's made since the war, about becoming a postal worker because it felt like the opposite of being a soldier, delivering things instead of destroying them, connecting people instead of killing them, and about how every letter he delivered for 35 years felt like a small repayment for the life Margaret gave him. He tells her about the nightmares he had for years after the war, not about combat, but about dying alone, about being left to bleed out because he was wearing the wrong uniform and nobody cared enough to save him, and about how in those nightmares Margaret would appear, not always as herself, sometimes just as a presence, a hand holding his, a voice telling him he mattered, and the nightmares would dissolve into something bearable, something that let him keep living instead of drowning in the guilt that so many German soldiers drowned in after realizing what they'd been part of, what they'd enabled, what their uniforms represented to the world. Margaret tells him something she's never articulated before, that saving him saved her too in a way. That after 3 years of war, after watching hundreds of men die, after making triage decisions that meant choosing who lived and who didn't, she'd started to feel like she was becoming the kind of person who could look at human suffering and calculate its value in terms of nationality and strategic importance. And the choosing to save Ernst, choosing mercy over logic, humanity over practicality, pulled her back from that edge, reminded her who she wanted to be instead of who war was making her become. "You think you saved me," Margaret says on their last day together, sitting in Ernst's garden while his grandchildren play nearby, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening over tea and biscuits. "But I think maybe we saved each other. I needed to know that I was still capable of seeing people instead of problems. You gave me that. You gave me proof that in the worst circumstances we can still choose to be decent." Ernst nods, understanding immediately because he's spent 50 years thinking about the same thing, about moments that define you, about choices that ripple forward through time, about the way a single act of mercy can become the foundation on which you build everything else. They talk about the letters, about the 50 years of searching, about the near misses, and the frustrations and the times they almost gave up but didn't. Ernst tells her about a letter he wrote in 1987 to a British veterans organization, asking if anyone remembered a field hospital near Caen, a British nurse who saved a German prisoner. The organization never responded, probably thought it was a crank letter, probably couldn't imagine why anyone would care, and Ernst spent 3 years thinking that was it, that he'd exhausted every possibility, that Margaret was either dead or didn't remember or never wanted to be found. Margaret tells him about almost giving up in 1989, about sitting with Robert, who died 6 months later, never knowing his wife's search would end, and saying, "Maybe you were right, maybe I need to let this go," and about how the Berlin Wall fell 3 weeks later, and she took it as a sign, which she knows sounds absurd, but she doesn't care because signs are what you make them, and if the world can change that dramatically in a single night, maybe impossible things aren't as impossible as they seem. They exchange gifts before Margaret leaves. Ernst gives her a photograph, him at 19 in uniform, taken a month before D-Day, before Normandy, before the shrapnel that should have killed him. He's written on the back, "The boy you saved, thank you for every day since." Margaret gives him something she's carried for 50 years, a small piece of metal, flattened and scarred, about the size of a coin. It's the shrapnel they removed from his abdomen in 1944, the piece of metal that should have killed him but didn't. She kept it, stole it really, because she wasn't supposed to keep anything from surgeries, wasn't supposed to take souvenirs from dying patients, but she couldn't leave it behind, couldn't throw away the physical proof of the moment that changed her life. "I've been carrying you with me," she says, handing him the shrapnel, "for 50 years. I think it's time you carried yourself." Ernst takes it, holds it like it's sacred, which to him it is. Proof that he was dying, proof that he was saved, proof that Margaret didn't just remember him, but kept a piece of him close for half a century while searching for the rest of him. They embrace at the airport, and Margaret whispers something that Ernst will repeat to his grandchildren for years afterward, something that will become family legend. "You told me you'd remember always. You kept that promise. Thank you." Margaret dies in 1998, 4 years after finding Ernst, at 76 years old. Ernst speaks at her funeral, flies to England, stands in a church in Sussex, in front of Margaret's daughters and grandchildren and friends, and tells them about June 12, 1944, about a British nurse who chose mercy when she didn't have to, about 50 years of searching, about 4 days in Stuttgart that made the whole 50 years worth it. He tells them what Margaret told him in the garden, that sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back, that mercy isn't weakness but the hardest kind of strength, that in a world that constantly tries to convince us some lives matter more than others, the most radical thing we can do is treat every life like it matters equally. Ernst dies in 2002 at 78. His family finds the shrapnel among his possessions, kept in the same small wooden box Margaret gave it to him in. They find the photograph Margaret gave him, kept in his wallet, worn from years of carrying. They find letters, dozens of letters between Ernst and Margaret from those 4 years after they found each other, and in the last letter Margaret wrote before she died, she says something that Ernst's grandchildren will read at his funeral, something that will make everyone cry. "I spent 50 years looking for you to find out if saving your life mattered. Thank you for teaching me that every life we save matters, not because of what they do with it, but because they get to live it That's enough. That will always be enough. Two people connected by 6 days in hell and 50 years of searching. A British nurse and a German soldier who became proof that in war, in the worst place we create for each other, moments of grace don't just exist. They echo forward through time, shaping lives and families and futures that wouldn't exist without them. Margaret Hayes saved Ernst Kohler's life on June 12, 1944, and Ernst Kohler spent the rest of his life proving that she was right to do it, that the moment mattered, that mercy isn't wasted even when it's inconvenient, even when it defies logic, even when it saves the wrong person wearing the wrong uniform. Sometimes that's enough, sometimes that has to be enough. And for Margaret and Ernst, it was more than enough, it was everything.